Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Installing VMware vCentre 4. In this video, we'll start off by covering vCentre 101. In that section, I'll cover what you need to know about VMware's vCentre 4. From there, we'll talk about what's new in VMware's vCentre 4, and then move on to the installation requirements and prerequisites. Next, I'll talk about the components that are included in VMware's vCentre 4, the additional components you can install from the DVD, and then the additional add-ons that you can purchase or download from VMware. Next, we'll cover the required ports for VMware vCentre. Then I'll show you how to download VMware vCentre 4. After that, I'll talk about the advantages to installing VMware vCentre 4 inside a virtual machine running inside VMware ESX. And then I'll show you how to install VMware vCentre 4 step by step. And with that, let's get started. Now, for those new to VMware's vCentre, I've got a little vCentre 101 here just to provide you some of the basics about VMware's vCentre. First off, vCentre was originally called Virtual Center, and still that's what I may call it a number of times throughout this VMware vSphere training series, because that's what it's been known as for so many years. So VMware's vCentre was Virtual Center, and Virtual Center or vCentre provides you centralized control and visibility for multiple VMware ESX and ESXi hosts. And with the release of VMware's vSphere 4, vCentre 4 now contains the centralized licensing for your entire virtual infrastructure. Now, with previous versions of VMware vCentre called Virtual Center, the licensing server was a separate entity that you could install on another server if you chose to do it. But today, vCentre is the central license repository. And vCentre is absolutely necessary for most of the advanced features of VMware vSphere. That means that without vCentre, you cannot perform advanced features like vMotion, Storage vMotion, DRS, and VMHA. None of that is possible without VMware's vCentre. However, vCentre isn't a single point of failure. If vCentre goes down and the licensing is unavailable, the ESX host will keep on running, and most of those advanced features will keep on functioning. So you don't have to worry about VMware's vCentre being that single point of failure. It can be down for some period of time without any effect on your virtual infrastructure. And for those of you who are more visual learners, I have this nice graphic from VMware's website. Thank you, VMware.com. This graphic shows you VMware's vCentre server on the top, and it points out how it can manage all of your virtual machines, and those virtual machines are all running on your VMware vSphere servers or your ESX hosts, and that ESX server virtualization platform or the vSphere platform is of course running on your virtual machines down here on the bottom. Now, this graphic points out how VMware's vCentre server provides the automation for your virtual infrastructure. It provides the scalability that allows you to manage multiple ESX hosts and perform multiple tasks across your entire virtual infrastructure. And it provides the visibility into every level of the virtual infrastructure. Alright, so what's new in vCentre 4? Well, if you've used previous versions of the Virtual Infrastructure Suite, I think you'll agree that the new vCentre 4 and vSphere 4 has a very nice new user interface. There's a lot of new searching functionality that you can perform across your entire virtual infrastructure. There's new hardware monitoring features, there's new storage maps and reports, there's improved alerts and notifications. There's also improved performance graphs. You can now use host profiles to configure all of your VMware ESX servers the same way, and there's improved energy efficiency features. Primarily, that VMware's Distributed Power Manager is now a production-ready application. Now also, the new vCentre Orchestrator, which allows you to create workflows for your virtual infrastructure, is included in the standard version of VMware vCentre. vCentre offers improved patch management through Update Manager, and there's the option to purchase vCentre Server Heartbeat, which is high availability for vCentre. Now vCentre 4 offers the integrated P2V converter and improved guided consolidation. Now, something else that's very cool about VMware's vCentre 4 is that it manages up to 300 hosts and 3,000 virtual machines, but if you use the new server linked mode, you can manage up to 1,000 hosts and 10,000 virtual machines. Watch out for my video in this series covering VMware's vCentre server linked mode. Now, also in vCentre 4 are new APIs to integrate with products like system management tools from third parties. The Distributed Resource Schedule, or DRS, has been improved. There's automatic restart of failed virtual machines with VMHA. There's improved permissions and access controls. There's new integration with Windows Active Directory. You can now create custom roles and permissions, and there's session management to control the sessions that are connected to your VMware vCentre server. So what are the official requirements from VMware to install vCentre 4 on your physical server? VMware says that you should have a minimum of 2 CPUs on your physical server, and those should be 2 GHz or greater Intel or AMD x86 processors. You should have a minimum of 3 GB of RAM and 2 GB free on your disk. And then you'll need to have a database, either SQL or Oracle, running on that same server or a separate server. Or if you don't have an existing database server, you can install SQL Express during the installation of VMware vCentre server. But keep in mind that that may require more resources out of your physical vCentre server. And in this video, I'll be installing SQL Express when we install VMware vCentre 4. VMware also requires that you have a 1 gigabit network interface card on the physical server. Now in this video, we'll be installing VMware vCentre 4 inside a virtual machine running inside a VMware ESX server. And I'll tell you right up front that the ESX server that I'm using doesn't meet all these minimum requirements. Specifically, it's not a dual processor system. But by the same token, the Wired Brain Coffee Company, our fictitious company who will be using this new virtual infrastructure, will have a relatively small virtual infrastructure. I'm talking about 3 to 4 ESX hosts to start off with, and initially not more than 20 to 30 virtual machines. So by running SQL Express with VMware vCentre on the same server inside the same virtual machine in ESX, I can tell you that the performance will be just fine. And I can tell you that most of the SMBs today that are using VMware vSphere 4 will be using the SQL Express database that installs with VMware vCentre 4. So that's pretty standard practice. And I can also tell you that the CPU, RAM, and network interface requirements on this list aren't hard and fast requirements. In other words, you can install VMware vCentre 4 on a server that doesn't meet the CPU, RAM, and network interface requirements and still have a fully functioning vCentre 4 server. It just may not be a very high performance vCentre 4 server. And then as far as the operating system requirements that vCentre 4 can be installed on, surprisingly they say it can still be installed inside Windows XP Pro Service Pack 2. And of course it can also be installed inside Windows Server 2003, 64-bit editions, 32-bit editions, as well as the R2 version of Windows Server 2003. New with VMware vCentre 4 is that it's compatible with Windows Server 2008, 32 and 64-bit editions, as well as the Standard and Enterprise edition. And what we'll be installing vCentre 4 on in this video is Windows Server 2008 32-bit. Now, one of the most important things when it comes to installing vCentre is proper planning. You need to know the server's host name, IP address, usernames, passwords, port numbers. All those things are very important to document. And VMware is kind enough to offer a vCentre server installation worksheet that you can download from their website. I've included the link to this installation worksheet in the reference for this video. It's a great way to document your vCentre server installation. Now let's talk about some prerequisites for VMware vCentre 4 installation. As I said, you can install VMware vCentre inside an ESX virtual machine. And for that, you don't need to burn a physical DVD. However, if you're installing vCentre 4 on a physical server, very likely you'll want to burn a physical DVD so you can put it in the drive of the physical server. Now, alternatively, you could download the zip version of VMware vCentre 4, unzip it on your physical server, and then install vCentre 4 from there. Of course, if you're installing vCentre 4 from a DVD, you need a DVD drive on your physical server. Now, don't reinstall vCentre if you actually want to do an upgrade. You need to follow the upgrade process instead. Now, prior to the installation of VMware vCentre 4, you need to ensure that your vCentre server is a member of a domain and that you're logged in as the domain administrator. And that's because VMware vCentre 4 needs access to the Active Directory in order to use the integrated Windows Active Directory features. You also need to make sure that your vCentre 4 server has the correct time and date. And to do that, I recommend configuring NTP or the Network Time Protocol on your vCentre server. Now, a few other prerequisites here are that your computer name on the vCentre server cannot be more than 15 characters. This is critical, or else you're going to have problems with your vCentre server. Also, the vCentre server should not be an Active Directory domain controller. Now, the account that you're logged in with when you install vCentre server should be a member of the administrator group, should be able to act as part of the operating system, and should have the permission to log on as a service. Alright, some more installation prerequisites are that your server should have a static IP address. I highly recommend that, just like I highly recommend it for all of the other servers in your infrastructure. Now, the name of your server should be in DNS with a matching name, and you must be able to resolve it from all of your ESX hosts. The disk that you're installing vCentre 4 on should be an NTFS formatted disk, and ahead of time you should know if you want to use standalone or the new linked server mode. Now, you'll only need to use linked server mode if you'll have more than 300 ESX hosts or more than 3,000 virtual machines. Now, you can run the vCentre 4 installers from a network drive, but you cannot install vCentre 4 on a network drive. Now, let's talk about the database requirements for VMware vCentre 4 and Update Manager. Like I said, you have two options. You can use an existing SQL Server or Oracle database, or you can install SQL Express on the local vCentre server when you install vCentre 4. Now, for larger deployments, a separate database is recommended for vCentre 4 and Update Manager. Now, each new vCentre server must have its own database. You cannot share a database in SQL or Oracle between multiple vCentre servers. Now, for an existing database, you should check to ensure that your version is supported and that it has the necessary patches installed. I've included links in the reference for this video where you can review the database and patch requirements. Now, also for an existing database, you'll need to create a 32-bit DSN prior to the vCentre server installation. Now, something to keep in mind is that even if you use SQL Express on the local machine, standard database maintenance must be performed periodically. In other words, as your virtual infrastructure grows, you may want to have a DBA take a look at your SQL Express databases to ensure that they don't need some maintenance like reorganization. Alright, so what are the required components of VMware vCentre 4? Well, if you perform the minimum vCentre 4 server installation, you'll install three components. You'll install vCentre Server, you'll install .NET 3.0 Service Pack 1, and you'll install vCentre Orchestrator. Now, like we said, your vCentre server will need a database, and if you don't have an existing database, you'll be installing SQL Server Express 2005 on the vCentre server. Now, optionally, you can install the vSphere client, you can install the vCentre Converter Enterprise, you can install vCentre Guided Consolidation, and vCentre Update Manager. All of these components listed here are on the vCentre server installation DVD. And the last four components, the vCentre Client, Converter Enterprise, Guided Consolidation, and Update Manager, all of these components have to be installed separately. In other words, you would install vCentre Server 4 and then SQL Express along with it. Then you would go back and install the vCentre Client, then Converter Enterprise, then Guided Consolidation, and then Update Manager. Of course, you can install those last four components in any order that you choose. Now, sold separately, there's a number of add-on components that can be used along with VMware vCentre 4. Of course, there's features like vMotion, SVMotion, DRS, DPM, VMHA, and fault tolerance. You can add on Site Recovery Manager, or SRM. You can add on the new Chargeback module. You can add on Lab Manager, vCentre Server Heartbeat, App Speed, Data Recovery, and then coming late in 2009, they'll have vCentre Server add-ons like Capacity IQ and Config Control. So let me briefly tell you what some of these options are. Site Recovery Manager, of course, is used with disaster recovery to automate the recovery of your virtual infrastructure. Chargeback is used to bill out the divisions of your company for the virtual infrastructure resources that they used. Now, Lab Manager is used to automate the creation of virtual labs. Now, vCentre Server Heartbeat is actually a third-party option from Neverfail that VMware has repackaged as vCentre Server Heartbeat, and really it's a high availability option for VMware vCentre. AppSpeed is used to analyze the performance and ensure the quality of service of the applications that are running in your virtual infrastructure. Data Recovery is a backup and recovery application for the VMware vSphere suite, and I've got a number of videos covering data recovery in this video series. Now, Capacity IQ is used to analyze the capacity of your virtual infrastructure and ensure that it's aligned with the needs of your business. With Capacity IQ, you can also perform what-if impact analysis and forecast the capacity needs of your infrastructure in the future. And then finally, there's Config Control, which is used to automate the configuration of your virtual infrastructure. So those are some very cool add-ons for VMware vCentre 4 that are sold separately. Now let's cover the required ports for VMware vCentre. When you go to install VMware vCentre, you'll be asked if these ports, these default ports, will be acceptable to you. Now, 99% of the installations of VMware vCentre take the default port numbers, and I encourage you to do that as well. So the port numbers are 443 for HTTPS Web, 80 for HTTP Web, 902 for Heartbeat for the ESX host, and 902 and 903 for the vSphere Client Remote Console. LDAP for directory services of 389, 636 for the SSL directory services, and 8080 for the vCentre Web Access, and 8443 for the VMware vCentre Management Web. Now, if you have a firewall configured on your VMware vCentre 4 server, these ports will have to be opened up, or if you're accessing VMware vCentre 4 through a firewall, again, you'll have to configure these ports to be allowed to pass through. Okay, so hang with me just a little bit longer. We're almost to the point of installing VMware vCentre 4, but first we need to download it. Now, you can do a 60-day evaluation of VMware vCentre 4 if you go to vmware.com/tryvmware. Or if you have a registered license, you can just download the ISO version of VMware vCentre 4 from vmware.com/download, and that's what we'll be doing in this video. VMware vCentre 4 is available as an ISO or a zip file, as I mentioned before, but if you plan on burning a physical DVD, you'll want the ISO version. Now, VMware vCentre 4 is a 1.7 gigabyte ISO, and it should be named something similar to VMware-Vim Setup-EN for English, -4.0.0, and that's the version number right there, and then -140822, and that's the build number, and then the .iso, of course, tells you that it's an ISO image. Alright, so at this point, let's go to vmware.com/download, and let's download our image of VMware vCentre 4. Okay, I'm over here at my web browser, and I'm at vmware.com/download. You can see the first option here is VMware vSphere 4. Now, I'm going to click download, but if you wanted to do the 60-day evaluation, you could click evaluate right there. I'll click download here. Now, again, we're given the option to either try VMware vSphere 4 for 60 days and evaluate it here, or buy VMware vSphere 4, which would, of course, include VMware vCentre 4. Now, over here on the left, the downloads list starts off with VMware ESX4, then there's ESXi4, and then here's the option we want, VMware vCentre 4. Of course, I encourage you to read the release notes here, and these are going to tell you what you need to know before you get started. They'll also tell you about any open issues or known issues related to VMware vCentre 4. Let's click back, and I'll click on the download link here for VMware vCentre 4. Now, of course, if you're evaluating VMware vSphere, or you've already purchased the vSphere suite, you'll have a username and password to log in right here to download vCentre 4. So let me go ahead and enter my username and password. Okay, now we're asked to accept the end user license agreement. We'll scroll down to the bottom and say yes. And finally, we're given the option to download VMware vCentre 4. Now, the first option here is the ISO image of vCentre 4. It says it's 1.8 gigs. Then there's the zip version of VMware vCentre 4. It says it's 1.5 gigs. Now, separately, we could download the vSphere client and the host update utility. We could download the VMware vCentre Converter boot CD, and we could download the VMware vCentre Converter CLI for Linux. But in our case, let's just scroll up here, and I'm going to click on the ISO image, and this brings up the download manager, and then we can say save file right here, and that would begin the download process of VMware vCentre 4. However, I can tell you I've already downloaded vCentre 4, and I have a CD in my drive and ready to go so that we can start the installation process. So let's save a ton of time because we don't have to download that 1.8 gigabyte file. I'll close this out, and let's go back to our slides. And now I want to talk for a second about the advantages to installing vCentre inside a virtual machine. Now, many virtualization admins feel most comfortable installing vCentre on a physical server, and if that's how you choose to do it, then that works just fine. However, I can tell you I've had good experience installing vCentre inside a virtual machine that's running inside ESX, and I like to do it that way for a number of reasons. The first reason being that I don't have to purchase or manage a physical server for vCentre 4. Now, by doing it this way, you can also use the features of vSphere to help in the management of that virtual machine. For example, you can use vMotion to move vCentre 4 from one ESX host to another if you need to perform maintenance on that physical ESX server. You can also gain high availability if you put your vCentre 4 server inside a VMHA cluster. Now, before you apply operating system patches to the vCentre 4 server, or before you perform an upgrade of VMware vCentre, you can use the snapshot functionality of VMware vSphere. You can also back up your vCentre 4 server with the same method that you use to back up other virtual machines in your infrastructure. For example, you could get features like incremental image level backup of your vCentre 4 server. And also, I want to point out once again that your ESX hosts are not 100% dependent on VMware vCentre. In case the vCentre server goes down for some reason, your virtual machines are going to keep functioning, the ESX hosts are going to keep functioning, and even advanced vSphere features like DPM and VMHA are going to keep on working even if the vCentre server is down. Alright, so hang with me. We're about to install vCentre 4. I've just got 12 steps to review with you that will be used in the installation process. Now, step number 1, of course, is to burn the ISO image to a DVD or mount the image inside your virtual machine. Now, once you access the DVD, the auto run on the DVD should kick in, and you'll be given a menu that will ask you what you want to install. Of course, the first thing you want to install is VMware vCentre. From there, you'll need to agree to the license, and then you can enter any user info and optionally enter a license number. If not, vCentre 4 will be installed in a 60-day evaluation mode, and you'll have to enter a license before the 60 days is up if you want to keep using it. Now, next you'll be asked to enter your database type and choose a database account. From there, you'll need to choose an installation folder or just take the default installation folder. You'll need to tell the installer if vCentre will be installed in server linked mode, and then you'll have to accept the port numbers that we talked about earlier. Finally, you'll be asked if you're sure you want to install vCentre. You can say yes, and the installation will start. The installation will take a few minutes, and it'll take even longer if you opted to install SQL Express. Now, once the installation's done, you can click Finish, and you're ready to start using VMware vCentre 4. Now, after that, you can choose to go back and install any optional components like VMware's Update Manager. Alright, and with that, let's install VMware vCentre 4. First, let me review with you the infrastructure we'll be using to install and run vCentre 4. I'm going to be installing vCentre 4 inside a virtual machine running on ESX server number 1 at the Wired Brain Coffee Company. I've already connected to ESX server number 1 using the vSphere client, and you can see here we're connected to ESX number 1. This is a Dell quad-core server, and it has 8 gigabytes of RAM. And what I've done here is I've created a virtual machine called vCentre. Now, this is a Windows 2008 server, 32-bit virtual machine. It just has one CPU, one virtual CPU, and I only allocated 2 gigabytes of RAM, which is going to work just fine. I allocated a 40 gigabyte virtual disk for this virtual machine, and what I've done is I've taken the ISO file that I downloaded from VMware's website, and in my case, I actually burned it to a DVD, and I put that DVD inside the ESX server, the physical DVD drive on the ESX server. Now, as an alternative, I could have browsed the data store here on this ESX server, and I could have used the file transfer option to transfer that ISO image over to this ESX server. The next thing I did was I edited the settings on the virtual machine, and if you take a look at the CD DVD drive here, right now it's mapped to the physical DVD drive on this ESX host, and that's where my DVD is for VMware vCentre 4. Now, if I had have transferred the ISO file, I could have used the data store ISO file option here, and I could have mounted the ISO file to install vCentre 4. Now, a third option here would be to use a client device. So I could actually just keep the ISO file on my computer that's running the vSphere client, and I could mount that ISO file over the network using the vSphere client. Alright, so we're going to choose host device here, and we'll say OK. Now let me show you just a few more things that I've done on this virtual machine. I allowed remote desktop inside the Windows operating system, and I've already connected to the virtual machine using remote desktop down here. So this is the computer that's about to be our vCentre 4 server. Now, something else I did on this computer is I configured a static IP address. Let me bring up the Network and Sharing Center here. Let's go into View Status on the network interface. And you can see here the DHCP is not enabled, and I configured a static IP address on this virtual machine, 10.0.1.50. It also has the DNS servers properly configured to point to the local DNS server on my network at the Wired Brain Coffee Company. Notice that the connection-specific DNS suffix is wiredbraincoffee.com, and let me show you the name of the server over here. If we go to Start, I'll right-click on my computer, I'll go to Properties, and look at the computer name here. It's vCentre 4. The full computer name is vcentre4.wiredbraincoffee.com. So what that tells me is that this computer, this server, is a member of the domain. Check that out. Domain is wiredbraincoffee.com. So that's right. What I did is I went in here and I said I wanted to change from a work group to a domain. So we have this new computer named vCentre 4. It's in the domain wiredbraincoffee.com. I'll say cancel here. So one more important thing is that I'm logged into this computer as the domain admin in the Wired Brain Coffee Company. So let's review. This computer is a member of the domain. It has a static IP address. It knows where its DNS servers are. But do those DNS servers have a record for this computer? Well, let's verify that. We said the name of this computer is vCentre 4, and it has an IP address of 10.0.1.50. I'm going to minimize the connection there to our vCentre server, and let's go over to our DNS server, which is right here. So currently I don't have a record for the new vCentre server. This is something that I really need to do because this is a static IP on this server, and this is a critical piece of my virtual infrastructure. So I'm going to go up here and add a new host. It's going to be called vCentre 4, and I'll type in the IP address here, 10.0.1.50. I'll say add host, and it says that the host record for vCentre 4 was successfully added, and we can see it listed there on the bottom. All right, great. That's an important piece of this puzzle. And now we should be able to ping that vCentre 4 server by name. I'll bring up my command prompt and I'll say ping vCentre 4. And it resolves to 10.0.1.50. But we still can't ping it. Why is that? Well, that's because Windows 2008 Server by default installs the firewall. So let's drop the firewall for a minute just for testing purposes, and then let's see if we can ping it again. I'm going to go to the Network and Sharing Center. I'm going to click on Windows Firewall, and I'm going to say turn on or off Windows Firewall. Let's go ahead and turn it off for now, and that way we don't have to worry about any port filtering issues. I'll close out these windows, and then let's tab back to our command prompt here. I'll do an up arrow, and now we're able to successfully ping our vCentre 4 server by name. We know the traffic's going through. We know there's no firewall that's going to interfere with any connections of any kind. If you'd like a software firewall enabled on your server, I encourage you to go back later, turn it on, and open up the ports that we talked about back in our slides. So let's exit out of this, and let's go back to our vCentre 4 server. And we have our vCentre 4 DVD in the drive. I'm going to open up my computer, and I see a DVD drive here. I'll double click on that, and that starts the auto run for the vCentre 4 server installation. I'll close this out, and as I talked about, there's a number of things you can install from this one installation DVD. Not only vCentre server, but also guided consolidation, the vSphere client, vCentre update manager, converter, or of course you can explore the media. Now in our case, we need to just get started by installing vCentre server, so I'll click on that. And here we need to acknowledge that we want the English language. It also supports Chinese, German, and Japanese. I'll say OK there. And this starts the installation process. Alright, it says welcome to the installation wizard for VMware vCentre server. We'll click next to get started. We'll accept the license agreement here. And now we need to enter our user information. I'll type in my name. I'll type in our organization, wiredbraincoffee.com. And at this time, I won't enter a licensing key. We'll just move into evaluation mode by default. And then later in our licensing video, I'll show you how to configure licensing inside VMware vSphere. I'll say next here. Now in our case, we don't have an existing database. I don't have an existing SQL or Oracle server on my network. And in fact, I have a very small network in the case of the Wired Brain Coffee Company, and we expect to only have 3 to 4 ESX hosts. And I'm sure that the Microsoft SQL Server 2005 Express install on this local server will handle the needs of our virtual infrastructure. So I'll just take the default here and we'll install SQL Server on this computer. Now we'll take the default of using a system account to run our vCentre server services on this computer. I'll say next here, and then we're asked where we'd like to install vCentre server. The default is C:\program files /VMware /infrastructure. Sounds good to me, so I'll say next here. And like I said, you're asked at this point whether or not you plan to use the VMware linked mode to share information between multiple vCentre servers. Well, in the case of the Wired Brain Coffee Company, initially we plan to have a small virtual infrastructure and we won't be using linked mode. So what I'll do here is I'll say next, and we'll take the default of having a standalone VMware vCentre server instance. Now you're asked to configure or confirm the default ports that will be used by VMware vCentre. We'll take the defaults here and just say next. And finally, you're asked to confirm whether or not you want to start the installation. Absolutely. Let's get started and let's install VMware vCentre 4. Now the installation will take a few minutes as it goes through and installs the .NET framework. It'll install SQL Server Express, and it'll install VMware vCentre Server. During that time, I'm going to pause the video recording, and I'll be right back as soon as it's done. Okay, there we go. In under 5 minutes, VMware vCentre Server has been successfully installed. I watched it install .NET, the SQL Server Express 2005. It installed the vCentre services, Tomcat, VMware Web Access, and finally, VMware Orchestrator. And now we can click Finish to exit the installation wizard. And at this point, if you wanted to go back and install any of the optional components, you could. I'll be doing that later in this video series, but for now I'm just going to exit out of the installation application, and let's find out if this vCentre server really works. Let's minimize this connection to our vCentre server. And as you see here, I already have the vSphere client installed, so what I can do is I'll close this out, and I'll restart my vSphere client, and this time let's connect to vCentre 4. That'll be the name of our vCentre server, and then we'll log in for now as the domain administrator. But later we'll be setting up security and authorizing users so that we can use our own account. We get the standard security certificate warning here. I'll say that I want to install this certificate and do not display the security warning again. I'll say ignore here. Alright, and there we go. We've successfully connected to our new vCentre 4 server at the Wired Brain Coffee Company. As we haven't configured licensing yet, we get this message that our evaluation license will expire in 60 days. I'll say OK there. And we see the standard Getting Started screen that prompts us to create a data center. I'll be going through creating data centers and adding our ESX hosts in an upcoming video. But for now, we've proven that our VMware vCentre 4 server was successfully installed. It's up and working. And with that, let's go back to our slides. Alright, and that means we've reached the summary for this video. In this video, we started off with a vCentre 101 overview of what vCentre can do for you, how it's a centralized management tool for your virtual infrastructure, how it manages your ESX hosts and virtual machines. And without vCentre Server, you cannot perform the advanced features of the vSphere suite. From there, we moved on to what's new in vCentre Server 4. We talked about the improved user interface, the new search functionality, improved features around power management, new maps, new reports, and the option to add a lot of new features like fault tolerance and chargeback and data recovery. Next, we moved on to the installation requirements and prerequisites. We talked about what the physical server should have in terms of RAM, CPU, disk, and network, but then we also talked about the operating system requirements and the database server requirements. Then we covered the vCentre Server components and the add-ons. When you install vCentre Server, you install not only the vCentre Server services, but also features like Web Access, Orchestrator, the .NET Framework, and so on. On that same DVD, you can install other features like Update Manager and Guided Consolidation. And then, of course, you can purchase add-ons from VMware that are sold separately, things like Data Recovery, Chargeback, App Speed, and in the future, things like Capacity IQ and Config Control. Then we reviewed the ports that are required for vCentre Server. Then I showed you how to download vCentre Server 4 from the VMware website. I talked about the advantages to installing vCentre Server inside a virtual machine on your ESX host. And in fact, when we went to install vCentre Server, that's exactly how we did it. We installed vCentre Server. I showed you how to do it step by step. There were 12 steps. I talked about how you need to burn the DVD if you actually plan to put it in the physical server's DVD drive. I talked about how the server needs to have a static IP address, and that IP address needs to have an alias inside DNS. The DNS servers need to be properly configured, and you need to have full communication, including DNS with fully qualified domain names, between your ESX host, your client that's running the vSphere client, and the machine that's going to be your vCentre server. I showed you how my vCentre server was a member of the domain, and that's something that you need to do, and then I logged on as the domain administrator before I installed vCentre Server 4. The installation was really quick and easy, and then when we were done, we connected to the vCentre server using the vSphere client. And with that, we've reached the end of our video covering installing vCentre Server 4. We'll be talking about and using VMware's vCentre 4 throughout the entire video series, as it's really the hub that makes up all of the features and functionality of the entire vSphere suite. Thank you very much.